Hello friends and history enthusiasts, how are you? I hope everything is going well. Today, we will journey through the astonishing realities of those prehistoric times when our ancestors not only survived, but also mastered fields such as art, medicine, and music. If this thrilling and fascinating historical journey piques your interest, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, thinking about the ancient medicine of that era, I'm curious, which historical discovery surprises you the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Humanity almost didn't make it. Around 70,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption, commonly associated with the Toba supervolcano, may have thrown the planet into a volcanic winter. Ash filled the sky, temperatures dropped, ecosystems collapsed. It was essentially prehistoric climate chaos, minus the news coverage and dramatic music. And early humans, they were already living one missed meal away from disaster. Some genetic evidence suggests that during this period, the global population of Homo sapiens may have dropped to just a few thousand breeding individuals. A few thousand. That's not a civilization. That's a large wedding. Which means every person alive today might trace their ancestry back to a surprisingly small group of extremely stubborn survivors who refuse to give up. No pressure. Imagine the situation. You are a hunter-gatherer. No farming, no stored grain, no emergency supplies. You wake up one morning and the sky is grey. It stays grey. It gets colder. Animals migrate or die. Plants fail. And your survival strategy is basically walk farther and hope. There were no backup plans. No, we'll just relocate to the suburbs. Just adaptation or extinction. Only the most resourceful groups survived. The ones who cooperated, shared food, moved intelligently, and didn't immediately panic when the sky turned apocalyptic. Which frankly is impressive because modern humans struggle when the Wi-Fi goes down for 20 minutes. Those survivors endured years of environmental collapse without even knowing what a volcano was. They didn't understand tectonic plates or atmospheric ash distribution. They just knew the world had changed and they adjusted. That bottleneck might explain something profound about our species. Humans are built for adaptation. We spread rapidly after that event into Asia, Europe, Australia, eventually the Americas, from almost extinct to everywhere. That is not just resilience. That is biological overachievement. So when you think about early prehistoric humans as fragile or primitive, remember this. They survived a planetary disaster that nearly erased them. You exist because a few thousand humans managed to outthink an ice age caused by a supervolcano, which means your family tree survived something far worse than a stressful Monday. And honestly, that deserves a little respect. For decades, Neanderthals were treated like the evolutionary blooper reel. Short, hunched, slow, permanently confused. Basically, the before picture in humanity's globe story. Except that narrative is wrong. Neanderthals had brains as large as, and in some cases larger than, modern Homo sapiens. Not slightly larger, noticeably larger. Their skulls were shaped differently, yes, but in terms of raw volume, they were not lacking. So, no, they were not caveman caricatures, dragging clubs and grunting at rocks. They made sophisticated stone tools. They hunted large animals in coordinated groups. They controlled fire. They wore tailored clothing made from animal hides. Tailored with tools in freezing climates. Neanderthals survived harsh Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. That is not incompetence. That is endurance at an elite level. And here's where it gets even more interesting. They buried their dead, not casually tossed aside, intentionally buried, sometimes with objects placed nearby. That suggests ritual, symbolism, emotional awareness. There is also evidence they used pigments and possibly body decoration. Some researchers even argue they may have created art. And yes, we interbred with them. Modern humans outside of Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. That means when Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, it wasn't just competition. It was collaboration. Let's call it cross-cultural exchange. So, the idea that Neanderthals were dumb brutes who got out-competed by superior modern humans is outdated. Their extinction was likely complex. Climate shifts, small population sizes, resource competition, maybe disease. Not because they were slow. In fact, in terms of physical strength, Neanderthals were probably stronger than us, more robust, built like prehistoric tanks, which makes the stereotype even stranger. Imagine dismissing a species that survived ice ages and megapora as primitive. Meanwhile, we panic over low battery notifications. The truth is this: Neanderthals were human. Different branch, same tree. They laughed, hunted, cared for. They're injured, likely told stories around fires. They were not the failed experiment. They were part of us. And if you're watching this from Europe or Asia, there's a good chance a small percentage of them is still walking around in your DNA. So next time someone calls you a Neanderthal, you can just nod proudly. Your ancestors survived, glacius. Now, here's something that feels illegal for prehistoric humans to have figured out. They performed surgery. Yes, actual surgery. There are skulls dating back thousands of years that show clear signs of trepanation. A procedure where a hole was deliberately drilled or scraped into the skull. And before you panic, here's the wild part. Many of these skulls show signs of healing, which means the patient survived. Let that sink in. No hospitals, no anesthesia, no sterile operating rooms, no gentle nurse saying, "You'll feel a small pinch." Just stone tools, firelight, and someone brave enough or desperate enough to attempt cranial surgery. Why did they do it? Possibly to treat head injuries. Maybe to relieve pressure after trauma. Some believe it had ritual or spiritual purposes, releasing evil spirits or curing illness. Either way, someone in that group understood that removing part of the skull might help instead of instantly kill. That requires observation, experience, trial, and error. And let's be honest, probably some very uncomfortable early attempts. Imagine being the volunteer for the first procedure. Good news, we think this might help your headache. What does it involve? Well, despite the crude tools, prehistoric surgeons displayed surprising precision. The openings were often smooth and carefully shaped. In many cases, they avoided damaging vital areas of the brain. That suggests knowledge of anatomy, not textbook knowledge, practical knowledge. They must have seen injuries, studied outcomes, noticed patterns. Maybe they observed skull fractures that healed naturally and realized bone could regenerate because yes, skull bone can partially regrow, which they somehow figured out without medical school. And this is what changes the narrative. Prehistoric humans were not blindly surviving day to day. They were experimenting, learning, passing down techniques. Surgery is not instinct. It's innovation. It's courage mixed with necessity. And while modern medicine is obviously more refined, thankfully the roots of medical intervention go back far earlier than most people imagine. So the next time you think early humans were just running around chasing mammoths, remember somewhere in a flickering cave under torchlight, a prehistoric human was performing brain surgery without Yelp reviews. And somehow it worked. For a long time, we pictured the first prehistoric men communicating through grunts, gestures, and the occasional dramatic pointing at a mammoth. Very cinematic, very wrong. The idea that complex language appeared late in human evolution is slowly collapsing, because the more we uncover about early humans, the harder it becomes to imagine them functioning without structured speech. Think about what they were doing. Coordinated hunts involving multiple people surrounding massive animals. That requires planning, timing, role assignment. You cannot successfully ambush a woolly mammoth using interpretive dance. You need communication, and not just you go there, I go here. You need abstract thinking, discussion of future events, shared strategy, probably even disagreement. Then there's tool making. Advanced stone tools require instruction, subtle shaping techniques, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. You don't transmit craftsmanship through grunts alone. Genetics adds another clue. The FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language ability appears in both modern humans and Neanderthals. That suggests the neurological capacity for language existed far earlier than we once believed, which means conversations around prehistoric campfires were likely far more sophisticated than we imagine. They probably had names, stories, warnings, jokes. Yes, jokes. Because humor requires language, and humans love humor. It relieves stress, strengthens bonds, builds group identity. Imagine sitting in a small hunter-gatherer group during an Ice Age winter. Darkness outside, firelight flickering. Someone reenacts the failed hunt from earlier that day, exaggerating how close they were to being trampled. That's storytelling. That's language. There's also the matter of symbolism. Cave art, beads, ritual burials. These all imply shared meaning. And shared meaning is much easier to maintain with structured communication. Without language, culture stalls. With language, culture expands. If early humans had language much earlier than once thought, then their mental world was rich, complex, layered with memory and imagination, which changes everything. They weren't surviving silently. They were narrating their survival. They were explaining the stars, teaching children, warning about predators, arguing about whose turn it was to gather roots. Language didn't suddenly appear in a dramatic evolutionary upgrade. It likely evolved gradually and much earlier, which means prehistoric men weren't just thinking, they were talking about it. And that makes them feel a lot less distant and a lot more like us. When you think of trade networks, you probably imagine ships, caravans, markets, spreadsheets, maybe someone arguing about tariffs. You probably do not imagine barefoot hunter-gatherers carrying volcanic glass across hundreds of km. And yet that's exactly what happened. What archaeologists have found obsidian tools in locations far from any natural obsidian source. In some cases, the stone traveled hundreds of km before being shaped into blades and points. That means prehistoric humans were not isolated survival bubbles. They were connected. Obsidian is sharp, extremely sharp. It fractures in a way that creates razor-like edges, ideal for cutting, hunting, crafting. So, if your local landscape didn't provide it, you either traveled to get it or traded with someone who did. And trade implies trust. It implies communication. It implies recurring contact between groups. You do not casually hand over valuable material to strangers unless you have some system of exchange. This suggests early humans maintained social networks across vast territories. Groups likely met seasonally, exchanging goods, information, possibly even marriage partners, to avoid inbreeding. In other words, prehistoric diplomacy. Without embassies. Trade also spreads ideas, tool designs, hunting strategies, symbolic objects. Cultural innovation doesn't happen in isolation. It thrives in connection. So the image of early humans as scattered, disconnected tribes barely aware of each other. Not accurate. They were networking, just without LinkedIn. And consider the geography involved. No maps, no paved roads, no GPS, just memory, landmarks, stars, and oral tradition guiding movement across landscapes. They knew their environment intimately. Rivers, mountain passes, seasonal migrations of animals. These weren't random wanderings. They were structured mobility patterns, which means prehistoric humans operated on mental maps far more complex than we often credit them for. Trade networks also mean something else. Peaceful interaction. Because if every encounter between groups ended in violence, exchange would not survive long. Conflict surely happened. But cooperation clearly happened too. And that might be the most underappreciated revelation. The first prehistoric men were not just hunters. They were negotiators, connectors, participants in social webs stretching across continents. All before the invention of the wheel, which makes modern delivery delays feel slightly embarrassing. If you think modern wildlife is intimidating, let's rewind a few tens of thousands of years. Prehistoric humans did not share the planet with deer and the occasional bear. They lived alongside woolly mammoths the size of moving hills, saber-toothed cats with fangs like kitchen knives, giant ground sloths larger than modern cars, short-faced bears that could look you in the eye while standing upright. This wasn't a nature documentary. This was Tuesday, and yet they survived. Not just survived, they hunted some of them. Hunting a mammoth required coordination, strategy, and courage bordering on questionable judgment. These animals weighed several tons. One wrong move and your hunting party becomes a cautionary tale. So, how did they do it? Teamwork, persistence, hunting, trapping, driving animals into natural bottlenecks, using spears designed for distance and penetration. This wasn't chaotic charging. It was calculated risk. And let's be clear, prehistoric humans were not apex predators by default. Physically, we are not the strongest, not the fastest, not armored, no claws, no fangs. Our advantage was cooperation and planning. While a saber-toothed cat relied on muscle and ambush, humans relied on coordination and tools, brains over brawn, and sometimes just enough brawn. Living alongside megafauna also meant constant awareness. Children had to be taught early which tracks meant danger, which sounds in the night required silence, which territories were safe. Their environment was not forgiving. But here's the twist. Within a relatively short evolutionary window after humans spread into new regions, many of these giant animals disappeared. Climate shifts played a role, yes, but human hunting likely accelerated their extinction, which means prehistoric humans were not just passive survivors in a dangerous world. They were active ecological forces. They reshaped entire ecosystems long before industrial machinery existed. So, the first prehistoric men were not fragile little figures hiding in caves from monsters. They were intelligent primates navigating a world full of creatures that now feel legendary. And instead of becoming myth themselves, they outlasted the monsters, which is either incredibly impressive or a warning. When we think about prehistoric life, we tend to imagine injuries ending badly. Broken leg, that's it. Infection, goodbye. Headache, probably fate. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Prehistoric humans were not helpless when it came to illness or injury. They experimented, observed, learned, and in some cases, they became surprisingly competent herbalists. Traces of medicinal plants have been found in ancient burial sites. Pollen from plants with known healing properties appears alongside skeletal remains. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of arrow and chamomile, plants with anti-inflammatory and soothing effects. This was not random chewing. It suggests intention. Someone noticed that certain plants reduced pain, that others helped digestion, that some eased fevers or soothed wounds. Trial and error. Absolutely. Probably a lot of error at first, but over generations, knowledge accumulates. And here's something even more impressive. Skeletal remains show individuals who survived severe injuries. Crushed limbs, broken bones, even partial blindness. These people lived long enough for bones to heal. That means they were cared for, fed, protected. You do not survive a debilitating injury in an Ice Age environment without help. Which means early humans were not just medically curious, they were compassionate. Medicine begins with two things: curiosity and empathy. Why is this person suffering? How can we reduce it? Those are ancient questions. Prehistoric medicine was not sterile. It was not precise. It was not always effective, but it was deliberate. They likely used plant picuses for wounds, animal fats as protective barriers, heated stones for muscle pain, smoke for preservation, and insect control. Knowledge was passed down orally. Elders likely acted as healers. Memory was the archive. And remember, this was happening tens of thousands of years before written medical texts, long before pharmacies, long before white coats and stethoscopes. The first prehistoric men were not just hunters and gatherers. They were early pharmacologists working with leaves and roots instead of laboratories. And somehow, against all odds, it worked often enough to keep the species alive. Before agriculture, before cities, before permanent houses, humans were already making music, which tells you something profound about our priorities. Archaeologists have discovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years. Some were carved from bird bones, others from mammoth ivory, carefully shaped. Precisely drilled finger holes. These were not accidental whistles. They were instruments. Functional, tuned, deliberate instruments. Let's pause on that. A prehistoric human living in a world full of predators and unpredictable weather took time to carve holes into a hollow bone. Not to hunt, not to cook, not to survive, but to create sound. That means music was not a luxury that emerged after stability. It was there from the beginning. Why? Because music binds groups together. It coordinates emotion. It strengthens memory. It reinforces ritual. It turns a cold night into a shared experience. Imagine an Ice Age evening. The fire is burning low. The hunt was successful. The group gathers. Someone lifts a bone flute and plays a melody that echoes softly against stone walls. Children listen, elders hum along, stories follow, music becomes memory. Memory becomes culture, and culture becomes identity. There is also evidence that rhythm played a role in coordinated work, group movement, dancing, ritual ceremonies, all likely tied to sound. You don't invent music accidentally. You invent it because silence is not enough. The idea that early humans were purely survival-driven creatures collapses when you realize they invested time in art, symbolism, and now melody. Music requires abstract thinking, pattern recognition, emotional expression. It suggests joy. It suggests grief. It suggests celebration. And here's the ironic part. The earliest music was created in a world far quieter than ours. No engines, no electronics, no background noise, just wind, animals, fire, crackling. And into that quiet, humans added something entirely new, organized sound, which means the first prehistoric men were not just surviving nature. They were adding to it. They were shaping the atmosphere of their world with rhythm and tone. Long before farming stabilized food supplies, long before cities rose, there was music. Because apparently being alive wasn't enough. We needed a soundtrack. Here's where things get truly fascinating. Prehistoric humans didn't just survive. They believed. They marked. They represented ideas, which means they practiced symbolism long before writing, long before alphabets, long before anyone carved laws into stone tablets. Shell beads, dating back tens of thousands of years, have been discovered in Africa and the Middle East. These were not tools. They were decorative, intentionally pierced and worn. Decoration implies identity. Identity implies self-awareness. Someone looked at a shell and thought, this means something. That is not primitive thinking. That is abstract cognition. Then there are the engravings, geometric patterns, carved into bone and stone, zigzags, cross-hatching, repeated shapes. These marks were not functional. They didn't cut meat or sharpen spears. They communicated, maybe group affiliation, maybe status, maybe belief, maybe just aesthetics. But whatever the reason, they carried meaning beyond their physical form. And then there's body paint. Ochre, a red mineral pigment, appears in many prehistoric sites. It was ground into powder and used to stain skin, tools, or objects. Red, symbolic, intentional. Were they marking themselves for rituals, for protection, for beauty, for intimidation? We may never know the full answer, but we know this. They weren't indifferent to symbolism. Even burial practices suggest abstract thought. Some bodies were laid fully in specific positions. Some were accompanied by objects, tools, beads, animal bones. That suggests belief in something beyond immediate survival. You don't bury someone carefully if you think they're just biological matter. You bury them carefully if you think they mattered. Symbolism requires imagination. It requires the ability to assign invisible meaning to visible things. A shell becomes identity. A pigment becomes ritual. A pattern becomes memory. And here's the deeper implication. Once symbolism appears, culture accelerates. Shared symbols create shared stories. Shared stories create group cohesion. Group cohesion strengthens survival. So symbolism wasn't decorative fluff. It was evolutionary advantage. The first prehistoric men were not simply reacting to the world. They were interpreting it. They were assigning meaning to it. They were building invisible structures, beliefs, identities, narratives, long before they built cities. And once humans begin to think symbolically, they are no longer just animals in nature. They are storytellers inside it, which changes everything. Here's something we rarely appreciate. Prehistoric humans navigated entire continents without maps. No GPS, no compasses, no street signs, no recalculating route voice gently judging your life choices. And yet they spread from Africa to Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. That is not wandering. That is strategic movement. Early humans understood landscapes intimately. Rivers were highways. Mountain passes were corridors. Coastlines were guide rails. They followed animal migrations, seasonal plant growth, shifting climates. They read the land the way we read screens. Mental maps formed through memory and storytelling. Elders passed down directions orally. Follow the river until the red cliffs. Turn where the sun sets behind the split mountain. Camp where the herd crosses. Landmarks weren't decorative, they were data. And then there's Australia. Humans reached it over 60,000 years ago. To do that, they had to cross open water. That means boats. Boats require planning, construction, cooperation, risk assessment. You don't accidentally drift across ocean channels in a perfectly timed migration. You choose to go, which implies something bold. Curiosity. The first prehistoric men were not just surviving their immediate environment. They were exploring beyond it. Why leave familiar land? Why risk open water? Why cross frozen tundra into unknown territory? Because humans pushed boundaries even back then. Navigation also required celestial awareness. Many hunter-gatherer societies used stars to orient themselves. While direct evidence from deep prehistory is limited, the consistent global pattern of star-based navigation suggests it may have ancient roots. Imagine traveling under Ice Age skies untouched by modern light pollution. The stars would have been overwhelming, clear, bright, reliable. They weren't lost. They were guided. What this reveals is simple but powerful. Prehistoric humans were not confused wanderers stumbling across continents. They were calculated movers. They tracked seasons, predicted migration patterns, remembered terrain. They carried geography in their minds, which means when we picture early humans as primitive and directionless, we're projecting modern dependence onto people who mastered the natural world in ways we've largely forgotten. They didn't need apps. They had awareness. And that might be the most underrated survival skill of all. It's impressive that prehistoric humans hunted mammoths and survived ice ages. But you know what's even more impressive? They raised children in that environment successfully. Infant mortality in prehistoric times was undoubtedly high. Illness, injury, malnutrition, predators, the odds were not exactly comforting. And yet, humanity continued, which means parenting wasn't just happening, it was working. Children in hunter-gatherer societies likely learned through observation and imitation. There were no classrooms, no textbooks, no structured lesson plans, but education was constant. How to track animals, which plants are safe, how to recognize danger, how to cooperate. Every adult was a teacher. And because survival required collective effort, childcare was probably shared across the group. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies observe alloparenting, where multiple adults help care for children. That system likely has deep prehistoric roots, which makes sense. If you are living in a small group and danger is everywhere, you do not raise children alone. You raise them together. There's also evidence that children were not treated as passive burdens. Miniature tools have been found at archaeological sites, suggesting children practiced hunting and crafting skills early. Learning wasn't delayed. It was integrated into life from the beginning. And here's something fascinating. Human childhood is unusually long compared to other animals. Our brains take years to fully develop. That extended dependency period might have allowed more time for learning complex social and survival skills. Prehistoric parents were not just keeping children alive. They were shaping adaptable minds. Imagine teaching a child to walk carefully across uneven terrain while watching for predators. Teaching them silence during hunts. Teaching them respect for fire. This wasn't theoretical education. Mistakes could be fatal, which means patience, protection, and guidance were essential. And the fact that we are here today proves something powerful. They succeeded. The first prehistoric men were not just warriors and hunters. They were fathers, mentors, caretakers in a world that did not forgive mistakes. And somehow, generation after generation, they kept the flame going, literally and figuratively, which may be the most extraordinary survival story of all. If evolution were purely brutal and selfish, prehistoric life would look simple. Strong survive, weak disappear. End of story. Except that's not what the evidence shows. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons of prehistoric individuals who lived for years, sometimes decades, with serious disabilities. Healed fractures that would have required long recovery. Severe arthritis, missing limbs, even individuals who were blind or partially paralyzed in an Ice Age environment. That doesn't happen without help. You do not survive a crushed leg in a hunter-gatherer society by sheer willpower alone. Someone has to bring you food. Someone has to protect you. Someone has to include you in the group. Which means prehistoric humans were not purely survival machines. They were compassionate. There's a famous Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar 1. This individual had a damaged arm, signs of blindness in one eye, and multiple injuries, yet lived many years after those traumas. He survived because others allowed him to survive. They fed him. They protected him. They valued him, and that changes everything. It suggests that empathy predates civilization, that caring for the vulnerable was not invented by organized religion or modern ethics. It was already there. Of course, cooperation makes evolutionary sense. A group that cares for its members strengthens social bonds. Strong bonds increase survival chances overall. But there's something deeper here. Prehistoric groups were small. Every member mattered. Knowledge mattered. Experience mattered. An injured elder might not hunt, but they could teach. Guide, remember, wisdom was survival currency. And even beyond practicality, the act of caring for someone who cannot immediately contribute reveals something distinctly human. We do not operate purely on cold efficiency. We form attachments. We protect. We invest in one another. In a world full of predators and scarcity, that choice is extraordinary. The first prehistoric men were not heartless brutes, focused only on strength. They were part of communities built on interdependence. And that interdependence may be one of the key reasons our species survived when others did not. Because brute force can win a fight. But cooperation wins history. Here's a revelation that feels slightly uncomfortable. Prehistoric humans may have been more generous than modern society. In small hunter-gatherer bands, food sharing wasn't optional. It was expected. If a hunter brought down a large animal, the meat was distributed among the group, not hoarded, not stockpiled in a private freezer cave, shared. Why? Because success was unpredictable. Today you hunt successfully. Tomorrow you fail. The system only works if everyone participates in mutual exchange. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies observe something fascinating. Boasting is often discouraged. A successful hunter downplays his achievement. The group might even tease him to prevent arrogance. This reverse dominance culture keeps egos in check. Imagine that. You take down a massive mammoth, and instead of applause, your group says, "Relax. It was a small one." It sounds harsh, but it preserves equality. Prehistoric groups were small, often between 20 and 50 individuals. In a group that size, selfishness is dangerous. If one person hoards food, resentment builds. If resentment builds, cohesion breaks. And without cohesion, survival collapses. So generosity becomes strategy. Sharing also reduces risk. If everyone knows that resources circulate, they are less likely to panic during scarcity. Trust stabilizes the group, and trust is powerful. This social structure likely limited extreme inequality. There were no palaces, no accumulated wealth in the modern sense. Your riches were skills, relationships, knowledge. Status existed, yes, based on hunting ability, wisdom, or experience. But material dominance was limited by mobility. If you own too much, you can't carry it. Minimalism by necessity. And maybe that shaped human psychology deeply. Our brains evolved in environments where cooperation was rewarded and extreme selfishness punished socially. Which raises an interesting thought. Modern systems reward accumulation. Prehistoric systems rewarded distribution. The first prehistoric men survived not because they were ruthless individualists, but because they were deeply interdependent. And in a world without banks, contracts, or laws, social trust was the ultimate currency, which might be the most radical revelation yet. We didn't start as competitive hoarders. We started as cooperative sharers, and that foundation built everything that followed. Here's a revelation that might make modern life feel slightly overcomplicated. The first prehistoric men did not have jobs, no resumes, no performance reviews, no Monday morning dread, and yet their societies functioned. Hunter-gatherer groups operated on flexible roles rather than rigid occupations. Yes, certain individuals were better hunters. Others excelled at gathering plants, crafting tools, or healing. But specialization wasn't fixed in the way modern careers are. Roles shifted based on need, age, skill, and circumstance. If food was scarce, everyone adjusted. If the group moved camps, everyone participated. Children learned multiple skills from an early age. Versatility was survival. There was no, "I don't do that. It's not in my job description," because there were no job descriptions. And surprisingly, studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest they often spent fewer hours actively gathering food than modern humans spend working. Once basic needs were met, time could be spent socializing, storytelling, crafting, resting. That doesn't mean life was easy. It means it was structured differently. Work was integrated into life, not separated from it. Hunting wasn't just calorie acquisition. It was cooperation, skill display, bonding. Gathering wasn't just foraging. It was knowledge sharing, exploration, rhythm. Labor and life weren't compartmentalized. And because there was no concept of accumulating wealth or climbing a corporate hierarchy, status revolved around contribution to the group. Respect came from competence and generosity, not from corner offices. This doesn't mean prehistoric life was utopian. It was risky, physically demanding, dependent on environmental conditions. But it was not built around endless productivity. Survival required effort, yes, but once survival was secured, time was reclaimed, which challenges a modern assumption that constant busyness equals progress. The first prehistoric men were not clocking in and out. They were participating in a fluid system of shared responsibility, and somehow without formal employment structures they managed to spread across continents, which suggests that human organization doesn't require bureaucracy to function. It requires cooperation and maybe a little less email. Here's the final and perhaps most unsettling revelation. The first prehistoric men were not halfway versions of us. They were us, not biologically incomplete, not mentally primitive, not emotionally stunted, fully human. Strip away electricity, written language, agriculture, and modern infrastructure, and what remains is not an inferior being. It's a hunter-gatherer with the same emotional range you have. They loved, they feared, they grieved, they formed friendships, they felt jealousy, they laughed, they worried about their children, they argued over decisions. They were not operating on instinct alone. They were operating on culture. Cave art shows creativity. Burial rituals show belief. Music shows emotional expression. Trade networks show social complexity. Care for the injured shows empathy. You cannot do all of that without a mind very similar to our own. The difference between you and a human from 40,000 years ago is not intelligence. It's accumulated knowledge. You inherited thousands of generations of experimentation, memory, and adaptation. They were the early chapters. You are the current edition. Imagine taking a modern human infant and raising them in a prehistoric environment. With enough adaptation, that child would grow into a functioning hunter-gatherer. Now, imagine taking a prehistoric infant and raising them in a modern environment. Given time and support, they would adapt here, too. That's how similar we are. The first prehistoric men were not distant alien ancestors. They were people living under different circumstances. And that realization is both grounding and humbling because it means all the complexity of modern civilization. Science, art, philosophy, technology rests on the same cognitive foundation that once tracked animal footprints in snow. We did not become human when we built cities. We were already human when we painted caves. The first prehistoric men were not the beginning of something crude. They were the beginning of everything. And if you look closely beneath the layers of modern life, their instincts still echo inside us. Curiosity, cooperation, fear, creativity. We didn't replace them. We expanded them. Which means when you look back at prehistory, you're not looking at strangers. You're looking at yourself. Just earlier in the story, in ancient Egypt, dreams were not random mental leftovers from the day. They were messages, structured, meaningful, potentially dangerous. If you woke up disturbed, you did not laugh it off. You paid attention. One of the most fascinating artifacts from this world is the Chester Batty, dream book dating to the reign of Ramesses II. It reads almost like a cosmic instruction manual. Each entry begins with the same formula. If a man sees himself in a dream, then comes the scenario, followed by a clear verdict, good or bad. If a man sees himself drinking cool water, good. It means purification. If he sees himself eating crocodile flesh, good. It means he will take something from an official. If he sees himself looking into a deep well, bad. Very bad. There was no grey area. The universe had already decided. To the Egyptians, dreams were messages sent from the divine realm. The barrier between the human world and the world of the gods thinned during sleep. A person lying on a reed mat in Thebes might in their dream be standing before Osiris or hearing a whisper from Thoth. Night was not empty. It was active. Temples even offered what we might call dream incubation. If someone sought guidance, they would sleep in a sacred space, hoping a god would appear in their dreams with instruction. Priests helped interpret the results. The right interpretation could influence medical decisions, political choices, even military plans. But there was fear in this system, too. Not every dream came from a benevolent source. Some were considered omens of chaos or punishment. A bad dream could signal divine displeasure. It might require ritual purification, offerings, or protective amulets. What stands out most is the confidence. The Egyptians did not debate whether dreams meant something. They assumed meaning. The only question was how to read it correctly. In a civilization obsessed with order, with Marat, balance, and cosmic harmony, dreams were not irrational intrusions. They were part of the system, a coded extension of reality. To dream in ancient Egypt was not to wander aimlessly through your mind. It was to receive correspondence from the divine, and you were expected to answer carefully. If the Egyptians organized dreams into neat categories, the Mesopotamians turned them into full-scale cosmic alerts. In ancient Mesopotamia, in cities like Babylon and Nineveh, dreams were not just personal messages. They were public warnings, political signals, strategic intelligence delivered by the gods. A king's dream could change the fate of an empire. Clay tablets from as early as the 2nd millennium before Christ record detailed dream omens. Entire series of texts were dedicated to interpreting them, especially the great compendium known as Ishkar-Zak, roughly translated as Series of the Dream God. Zak himself was believed to be the divine force behind dreams, a spirit who moved silently through the night. The structure was precise. If a man dreams that, followed by a scenario and its consequence. If you dreamt of flying, your status might rise. If you dreamt your teeth fell out, a family member could die. If you saw yourself entering a dark house, misfortune was approaching. These were not metaphors. They were forecasts. Mesopotamian rulers took dreams extremely seriously. Before battles, campaigns, or major political decisions, they paid close attention to what appeared in sleep. If a king had a troubling dream, priests were summoned immediately. Specialists, known as boo divers, analyzed every detail. What color was the sky? Who spoke? What direction did you walk? Nothing was accidental. If the dream was bad, rituals followed. Incantations were performed. Figurines representing evil forces were buried or destroyed. Offerings were made to appease angry gods. The future, they believed, could sometimes be softened if addressed quickly enough. One famous example appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Before facing danger, Gilgamesh dreams repeatedly. His companion, Enkidu, interprets the dreams, often reframing terrifying visions as signs of coming victory. Even heroes required interpretation. Unlike the Egyptian emphasis on order, Mesopotamian dream culture feels tense, almost anxious. The gods were powerful and unpredictable. A dream might reveal their favor or their wrath. Sleep was not peaceful. It was surveillance. The divine was always watching, always communicating. In Mesopotamia, to ignore a dream was reckless because the night was not empty. It was full of warnings, and the wise listened before dawn arrived. By the time we reach ancient Greece, dreams begin to shift in tone. They are still sacred, still meaningful, but now they become something else as well. Medicine. In the Greek world, especially from the 5th century before Christ onward, dreams were closely associated with healing. At the center of this practice stood Asclepius, the god of medicine. His temples, known as a Slayer, functioned as early healing sanctuaries, part hospital, part spiritual retreat, part sleep laboratory. If you were sick, injured, or suffering from something no physician could fix, you did not just swallow herbs and hope for the best. You traveled to an Asclepian. The most famous stood at Epidaurus, but others existed across the Greek world. Upon arrival, you purified yourself. You bathed. You offered sacrifices. You followed dietary restrictions. The body had to be prepared before the mind could receive divine instruction. Then came the central ritual, incubation. You would lie down in a special sleeping chamber called the abbot. The room was quiet, dim, sacred, and there, in the stillness, you waited for a dream. The belief was simple but powerful. Asclepius would appear during sleep and either heal you directly or provide instructions for your cure. Some accounts describe the god touching the afflicted body part. Others recount symbolic visions. Snakes, sacred animals of Asclepius, slithering across the sleeper as a sign of restoration. When morning came, priests recorded the dream. They interpreted it and prescribed action. Sometimes the cure was straightforward. Change your diet, apply a pus, perform a ritual. Other times, the healing was said to have already occurred during the night. Stone inscriptions from Epidaurus list supposed miracles. Blind men seeing again, lame individuals walking, chronic pain vanishing after one divine encounter in sleep. Whether exaggerated or sincere, these records show something important. Dreams were considered therapeutic events. What makes Greek dream culture distinct is this blend of faith and emerging rational thought. Hippocratic physicians were beginning to observe the body scientifically, yet dream incubation remained respected. Even philosophers like Aristotle wrote about dreams, attempting to understand their mechanics without entirely dismissing their meaning. In Greece, the night was not just a channel for prophecy. It was a clinic. To sleep in a temple was to place your suffering into divine hands and to trust that healing might arrive not through waking effort, but through a vision in the dark. As temples filled with sleepers waiting for divine intervention, a quieter revolution was happening in Greece. Not in sacred chambers, but in schools and shaded courtyards where philosophers asked a dangerous question. What if dreams are not messages from the gods at all? Plato treated dreams cautiously. In his dialogue, The Republic, he suggested that during sleep, when reason loosens its grip, the hidden desires of the soul emerge. The civilized part of the mind rests. The untamed part begins to speak. According to Plato, a person might dream of committing acts they would never allow themselves while awake, not because a god sent the image, but because the soul contains impulses it normally suppresses. Suddenly, dreams were not divine. They were psychological mirrors. Aristotle pushed even further in his work on dreams. He argued that dreams are products of the body and the senses when we sleep. He claimed external sensory input quiets, but internal impressions continue to move. The mind half alert weaves these leftover sensations into narratives. If you have a fever, you might dream of fire. If your stomach aches, you may dream of being struck. For Aristotle, dreams were natural phenomena. no divine courier required. This shift is subtle but profound. The authority over dreams moves from temple to thinker, from priest to philosopher. Interpretation becomes less about appeasing gods and more about understanding perception. Yet even Aristotle did not fully dismiss predictive dreams. He admitted that sometimes dreams appear to foreshadow events, but he suggested coincidence rather than prophecy. Humans remember the dreams that match reality and forget the many that do not. Meanwhile, other Greek thinkers debated whether dreams could still hold truth. Some believed the rational mind, when freed from daytime distraction, might perceive patterns more clearly in sleep. Not divine messages, but heightened intuition. What we see here is tension. Two worlds overlapping, the sacred and the rational coexisting uneasily. People still traveled to escape. They still feared ominous visions, but they were also beginning to ask whether the dreamer, not the god, was the source. In this era, dreams stop being purely external communications. They begin to turn inward. The divine voice slowly becomes the human mind, and the mystery deepens rather than disappears. As Greek philosophers debated whether dreams were natural or divine, another tradition treated the answer as obvious. In the Hebrew scriptures, dreams were one of the clearest channels through which God spoke. Joseph, son of Jacob, dreams a sheaf of wheat bowing before him and stars lowering in submission. The meaning is not subtle. His future authority is revealed before it arrives. Later, imprisoned in Egypt, Joseph interprets the dreams of others. A cupbearer restored to favor, a baker condemned. Eventually, Pharaoh himself dreams of 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin ones. Joseph decodes the message. Years of abundance followed by famine. Action is taken. An empire is saved. In this tradition, dreams are not vague symbols open to endless speculation. They are precise warnings and promises, but interpretation requires wisdom. Not everyone can read the code. The prophet Daniel plays a similar role in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a massive statue shattered by a stone. None of his advisors can explain it. Daniel can. The statue represents kingdoms that will rise and fall. The dream becomes political prophecy. What stands out here is authority. The dreamer is often a ruler. The interpreter is divinely guided. Dreams validate power, warn of danger, and reveal divine will. Ignoring them would be reckless. In the early Christian world, dreams continue to shape history. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph, husband of Mary, is warned in a dream to flee to Egypt to protect the child Jesus. Later, another dream tells him it is safe to return. Dreams guide movement, safety, destiny. But caution emerges as well. Not all dreams are from God. Some may be deceptive. Early Christian writers warn believers not to trust every vision blindly. Discernment becomes essential. This creates a delicate balance. Dreams are sacred but not automatically trustworthy. Interpretation requires spiritual insight. Unlike the Greek philosophical shift inward, the biblical world keeps dreams anchored in divine communication. They are not just reflections of the psyche. They are interventions. Sleep becomes a meeting place between heaven and earth. And in this worldview, the night is never neutral. It is charged with meaning, sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying, but always significant. To dream is to risk receiving instruction from something greater than yourself. And once you receive it, you are expected to respond. When Rome absorbed the cultures of Greece and the Near East, it inherited their dream traditions. But the Romans, as always, made them practical. By the 2nd century after Christ, dream interpretation had become almost professionalized. The most famous surviving guide comes from Artemidorus of Doldis, a Greek writer living under Roman rule. His work Honora Critica was not mystical poetry. It was systematic, detailed, surprisingly analytical. Artemidorus traveled widely, collecting thousands of dreams from merchants, soldiers, slaves, politicians, and ordinary citizens. He noticed something important. The same dream could mean different things depending on who had it. If a king dreams of losing his crown, it could mean political disaster. If a poor man dreams of wearing a crown, it might signal promotion or unexpected fortune. Context mattered. Unlike earlier omen lists that stamped dreams as simply good or bad, Artemidorus insisted that interpretation required understanding the dreamer's profession, social status, habits, and fears. A fisherman dreaming of the sea does not mean the same thing as a farmer dreaming of the sea. This was a shift toward personalization. Roman society, deeply concerned with status, inheritance, and public life, treated dreams as potential indicators of destiny. Ambitious men watched their dreams carefully. A general preparing for battle might consult interpreters. An emperor could be shaken by a single ominous vision. Suetonius records that Julius Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his statue pouring blood the night before his assassination. She begged him not to attend the Senate. He went anyway. Dreams in Rome often hovered around politics and mortality. Yet skepticism existed too. Cicero questioned whether dreams truly predicted anything. He argued that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We remember the dreams that match events and ignore the countless ones that do not. Still, dream manuals remained popular. Why? Because they offered structure in an unpredictable world. Empire brought wealth, expansion, and chaos. Dreams became one more tool for navigating uncertainty. What makes Roman dream culture fascinating is its blend of superstition and protoxicology. There is fate, yes, but there is also individuality. Personal circumstance shapes meaning. By now, dreams are no longer only divine decrees or philosophical puzzles. They are part of daily life, discussed in markets, debated in households, written into by. The empire may have controlled the Mediterranean, but at night, every Roman still faced the same mystery. The private theater of sleep, where destiny might whisper its next move. As the Roman world fragmented and Europe moved into the early medieval period, dream interpretation did not disappear. It flourished, especially within the intellectual centers of the Islamic Golden Age in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. Scholars treated dreams with both spiritual seriousness and analytical care. The most famous name associated with this tradition is Ibn Siryn, an 8th century scholar whose works on dream interpretation became widely circulated. Whether every text attributed to him was truly his remains debated, but his influence is undeniable. In the Islamic worldview, dreams were generally divided into 3 categories. First were true dreams believed to come from God. These were clear, meaningful, often calm and structured. Second were disturbing dreams attributed to Shaitan, meant to confuse or frighten. Third were ordinary dreams produced by daily thoughts and personal concerns. This classification is important. It acknowledges that not every dream carries divine weight. Discernment becomes central. The Prophet Muhammad himself is reported in Islamic tradition to have valued true dreams. Some sayings describe them as one part of prophecy. Early Muslims recorded dreams carefully, especially those believed to carry guidance or warning. Interpretation, however, was never random. Symbols carried layered meanings shaped by language, culture, and scripture. Water might represent knowledge. A lion might represent authority or danger. Climbing could signify ambition or spiritual ascent. But as in the Roman tradition, context mattered. A merchant dreaming of gold did not carry the same meaning as a scholar dreaming of gold. Personal situation shaped interpretation. What makes Islamic dream scholarship remarkable is its balance. On one side stands faith, dreams as possible divine communication. On the other stands structure, categorization, symbolism, methodology. Manuals were written not as mystical riddles, but as organized references. Dream interpretation became part of a broader intellectual culture that included astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. It was not fringe superstition. It was woven into scholarship. At the same time, caution was emphasized. Disturbing dreams were not to be spread publicly. One was advised to seek refuge in prayer rather than panic. Not every nightmare required dramatic action. In this era, dream interpretation matured into a disciplined art. It was no longer just prophecy or temple ritual. It became a science of symbols grounded in faith, shaped by culture, and guided by careful reasoning. And once again, the night remained meaningful, but it demanded wisdom to understand. As Islamic scholars refined dream interpretation into a structured discipline, medieval Europe wrestled with a different tension, fear. In Christian medieval thought, dreams could still be divine. Saints received visions. Monks reported symbolic encounters with angels. But alongside these sacred experiences ran a growing anxiety. What if the dream did not come from God? Medieval theologians divided dreams much like Islamic scholars had, though with heavier emphasis on spiritual danger. Some dreams were believed to come from God, others from natural bodily causes, and some, perhaps the most unsettling, from demons. The night became contested territory. Monastic writers, like Augustine, had already reflected deeply on dreams centuries earlier. Augustine admitted that dreams could reveal hidden desires or spiritual truths, but he warned against assuming divine origin too quickly. Human imagination, he argued, is powerful and unreliable. By the High Middle Ages, this caution intensified. Demonic deception became a real concern. A dream offering glory, pleasure, or secret knowledge might be a trap. The Church emphasized discernment. Priests, confessors, and spiritual advisors were often consulted to interpret troubling visions. At the same time, visionary mystics emerged. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who reported elaborate dreamlike visions filled with cosmic symbolism. Their experiences were recorded carefully, examined by church authorities, and sometimes approved as genuine revelation. Dreams, therefore, occupied a narrow path. They could elevate a person toward sanctity or push them toward heresy. Outside monasteries, ordinary people continued to treat dreams as omens. Dream manuals circulated quietly. Folk traditions blended Christian symbolism with older pagan motifs. A dream of falling teeth might still signal death. A dream of clear water might promise blessing. But official doctrine leaned cautious. The medieval world was deeply concerned with salvation. The state of the soul mattered more than the prediction of crops or politics. Dreams were evaluated not only for what they foretold, but for what they revealed about moral condition. Did the dream inspire humility or pride, peace or fear, faith or temptation? In this era, dream interpretation became a spiritual test. The night was no longer simply a channel for prophecy. It was a battleground, a space where divine grace and demonic illusion might compete for influence. To dream in medieval Europe was not merely to receive information. It was to navigate the invisible war for the soul. By the time Europe moved into the Renaissance and early modern period, something subtle but irreversible began to change. The heavens did not fall silent, but human attention slowly turned inward. Dreams were still recorded, still discussed, but the authority behind them shifted. The scientific revolution encouraged observation, experimentation, and natural explanation. Thinkers began to ask not what a dream foretold, but how it formed. Was it linked to digestion, to memory, to imagination? Physicians suggested that bodily imbalances, too much heat, too much cold, could produce vivid dreams. The supernatural explanation did not vanish, but it lost exclusivity. Then, centuries later, the shift became dramatic. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Sigmund Freud proposed that dreams were not divine messages at all. They were expressions of the unconscious mind, hidden desires, fears, unresolved conflicts, all disguised through symbols. For Freud, a dream was not about prophecy. It was about repression. Carl Jung followed, though with a different emphasis. He believed dreams connected not only to personal unconscious material, but to deeper archetypes shared across humanity. The symbols, the hero, the shadow, the flood, were ancient patterns emerging from the psyche itself. Notice what happened. For thousands of years, humans looked upward for dream meaning, to gods, to fate, to divine will. Now meaning pointed inward. The dreamer became the source. But something interesting remains consistent across all eras. No civilization treated dreams as meaningless noise. Egyptians catalogued them. Mesopotamians feared them. Greeks slept in temples for them. Islamic scholars classified them. Medieval Christians tested them. Modern psychologists analyzed them. The framework changes. The curiosity does not. Even today, people wake from powerful dreams and feel that they matter. We may not consult temple priests or clay tablets anymore, but we still search for interpretation. We still ask, why that image? Why that emotion? Why now? The ancient art of dream interpretation has not vanished. It has evolved. The language of the divine may have become the language of the subconscious. The temple may have become the therapist's office. The omen tablet may have become a journal beside the bed, but the mystery remains. When we close our eyes, something speaks. And across history, humanity has never stopped trying to understand the voice in the dark. Before kings carved decrees into stone, and before judges cited written statutes, law existed in a far more fragile form. It lived in memory. In the earliest human communities, justice was not written down. It was embedded in tradition. Customs passed from generation to generation shaped behavior. Elders remembered precedents. Clan leaders settled disputes. If a man stole grain or injured a neighbor, the response was negotiated in public, often in front of the entire community. Reputation mattered. Honor mattered. Balance mattered. But this system had limits. In small tribal groups, everyone knew one another. Social pressure kept order. If you violated a norm, you risked isolation. That alone could be deadly. But as villages grew into cities, Anonymity entered the picture. Strangers traded in markets. Property expanded beyond livestock and simple tools. Wealth accumulated in temples and storehouses. Conflict became more complicated. Memory was no longer enough. In southern Mesopotamia, where some of the world's first cities emerged, urban life introduced new tensions. Farmers relied on irrigation canals. Merchants transported goods across long distances. Laborers worked for wages. Contracts, debts, and land disputes multiplied. With complexity came confusion, and confusion threatened stability. Rulers began to understand something crucial. Authority needed to be visible, consistent, public. If justice depended only on the mood of a local elder, it could appear arbitrary. People might question decisions. Disputes could escalate into violence. Writing changed everything. Once humans developed the ability to record language in clay or stone, customs could be fixed. A rule could be made permanent. It could outlive the ruler who declared it. More importantly, it could be displayed. The idea of law transformed from shared memory to public statement. This shift was not just administrative. It was psychological. When rules are written, they feel solid, objective, almost sacred. A carved inscription does not argue. It does not forget. Early law codes did more than regulate behavior. They projected order. They signaled that society was governed not by chaos, but by structure. Before the famous codes of Hieronymus or Hammurabi, there was this critical transition from spoken tradition to written authority. Law moved from the human voice to the stone surface, and once carved, it changed the relationship between ruler and ruled forever. Once law moved from memory to writing, it needed a sponsor. In the city of around the 21st century before Christ, that sponsor was King Uramu, often overshadowed by later and more famous rulers. Uramu created what many scholars consider the earliest surviving law code in recorded history. Long before Hammurabi carved his towering stele, Uramu had already inscribed justice onto clay tablets. But this was not simply about rules. It was about power. Uramu ruled during a period of political consolidation in southern Mesopotamia. City-states had competed, risen, and fallen. Stability was fragile. To govern effectively, a king needed more than soldiers. He needed legitimacy. The prologue of his law code makes that clear. Uramu does not present himself as a mere administrator. He claims divine selection. The gods, particularly Nana, the moon god, had chosen him to establish justice in the land. Law, therefore, was not personal opinion. It was sacred duty. The code itself is striking in tone. Compared to later systems, it appears almost measured. Many offenses resulted in fines rather than physical punishment. If a man knocked out another man's tooth, he paid silver. If he caused bodily injury, compensation was required. This principle of financial restitution suggests something important. Early law was deeply concerned with restoring balance, not simply inflicting pain. However, social hierarchy remained central. The penalties varied depending on status. A crime against a free person was treated differently than one against a slave. Justice was structured around class, and that reveals the deeper function of the code. Written law was not purely about fairness. It was about order. It protected property, regulated marriage, addressed false accusations, and set standards for bodily harm. It created predictability in a growing society where personal retaliation could easily spiral into chaos. By writing law down, you reduced ambiguity. Disputes could be judged against a known standard. Authority moved from emotional revenge to structured consequence. But make no mistake, this was also a political tool. By presenting himself as the bringer of justice, Oromu strengthened his position as king. Law became propaganda as much as protection. With Oromu, we see the blueprint emerge. Divine authority, written rules, social hierarchy, and controlled punishment. The experiment had begun, and it would only grow more ambitious. If Oromu laid the foundation, Hammurabi built the monument. Around the 18th century before Christ, King Hammurabi of Babylon commissioned what would become the most famous law code of the ancient world. Unlike earlier fragments on clay tablets, his laws were carved into a massive stone, steely, nearly 8 feet tall. At the top, an image shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving authority. The message is unmistakable. These laws are divine in origin. Below that image, hundreds of legal provisions are inscribed in cuneiform script. They cover theft, marriage, inheritance, trade, assault, false accusation, and more. The range is impressive. This was not a narrow set of temple rules. It was a comprehensive attempt to regulate society. But what makes Hammurabi's code so striking is its structure of consequences. The principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, appears repeatedly. If a man destroys another man's eye, his own eye shall be destroyed. If he breaks a bone, his bone shall be broken. Justice becomes visibly proportional. However, proportional does not mean equal. As in earlier codes, social class shaped punishment. Harm done to a noble carried different consequences than harm done to a commoner or slave. A surgeon whose operation failed on a wealthy man might lose his hands. The same mistake on a slave resulted in financial compensation. Justice in Babylon reflected hierarchy. So why carve these laws publicly? Literacy was limited. Most people could not read them. The answer lies in symbolism. The stele was not only a reference document, it was a statement. It declared that Babylon was governed by order, not whim. That the king ruled under divine mandate. That disputes would be judged against established principles. In a growing empire filled with diverse peoples, such visibility mattered. Law unified territory, yet there is tension here. While the code promotes fairness and protection for widows and orphans, it also enforces strict penalties. It deters through severity. It controls through fear. Hammurabi's achievement was not simply writing laws. It was turning law into architecture, something monumental, immovable, and sacred. With him, legal codes became instruments of centralized power. Justice was no longer only about restoring balance. It was about reinforcing authority. And Babylon made sure everyone could see it carved in stone. While Mesopotamian kings carved their authority into stone to legitimize political rule. Another legal tradition emerged with a different foundation. Not empire, not city administration, but covenant. In the Hebrew tradition, the laws attributed to Moses were not presented as royal decrees. They were framed as divine commandments, delivered directly from God to a people bound in sacred agreement. The setting itself is dramatic. Mount Sea, thunder, fire, and a mountain trembling under divine presence. The 10 Commandments form the core, but they are only the beginning. The broader Mosaic law, recorded in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, outlines a comprehensive system governing moral conduct, ritual purity, social justice, property rights, and criminal punishment. Unlike Hammurabi's code, which centers on the king as mediator of divine justice, Mosaic law emphasizes a direct relationship between God and the community. The authority is not a monarch. It is the covenant itself. This distinction matters. The law was not only about regulating disputes, it was about shaping identity. Observing the law distinguished the Israelites from surrounding nations. Dietary rules, Sabbath observance, festivals and purity codes, boundaries. Law became culture. There are similarities to earlier codes. The principle of proportional justice appears again. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Compensation for injury is addressed. Property rights are protected. False testimony is condemned. But Mosaic law introduces something deeper. Moral theology woven into legal structure. Caring for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger is commanded repeatedly. Justice is linked not just to order, but to righteousness. Obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings consequence, not only socially, but spiritually. Punishments could be severe. Certain offenses carried capital consequences. Yet, the framework always ties back to covenant loyalty. In this system, law is not merely administrative. It is relational. The people agree to follow the commandments, and in return they remain under divine protection. Law becomes a bond. Unlike Babylon's towering stele, Mosaic law traveled with the community. It was read aloud, memorized, transmitted across generations. It did not rely on monumental display. It relied on collective commitment. Here, justice is not just about control. It is about faithfulness. And with this shift, ancient law codes evolve beyond royal authority. They become instruments of spiritual identity, shaping not only behavior, but belief itself. As more societies began writing their laws, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Justice was rarely blind. From Sumer to Babylon to ancient Israel, law codes reflected the structure of the societies that created them. They promised order, they claimed fairness, but beneath the surface, they reinforced hierarchy. In Mesopotamia, the difference between a noble, a commoner, and a slave shaped the outcome of nearly every case. The same injury could result in different consequences depending on who suffered it. Break the bone of a high-ranking man, and your own bone might be broken. Harm a slave, and the punishment could be reduced to compensation paid to the slave's owner. The law protected status. Marriage laws also reveal hierarchy. In many codes, women's rights were defined within the context of property and inheritance. A wife might have protections against unjust dismissal, but her status was tied to family structure and male authority. Adultery laws were often harsher for women than for men. Law stabilized the household, but on unequal terms. Even economic regulations carried social layers. Debt slavery was common in ancient Mesopotamia. If a man could not repay what he owed, he or a member of his family might be forced into servitude. Some law codes limited the duration of such bondage, attempting to prevent permanent collapse of free citizens into slavery. But the system itself remained intact. This tension is important. Ancient law codes were not written as abstract theories of universal equality. They were practical tools designed to maintain social order within deeply stratified societies. Kings and lawmakers were not trying to erase hierarchy. They were trying to manage it. Yet within that management, we see moments of restraint. Hammurabi's code contains provisions protecting widows and orphans from exploitation. Mosaic law commands fair treatment of the poor and the foreigner. Urumo's fines suggest attempts to avoid endless blood feuds. Justice existed, but always within boundaries. Law in the ancient world was less about equal rights and more about preserving stability. It balanced power without dismantling it. And that may be the most revealing truth about early legal systems. They did not invent fairness from nothing. They shaped justice according to the values and structures already in place. In doing so, they reveal not only how ancient societies punished wrongdoing, but how they understood power itself. If hierarchy defined who received justice, punishment defined how it was enforced. Ancient law codes were not gentle. They were direct, often severe, and intentionally public. Why? Because early societies feared chaos more than cruelty. In small communities without modern policing systems, deterrence had to be visible. A stolen ox was not just lost property, it threatened livelihood. A false accusation could destroy reputation and destabilize trust. An unpaid debt could unravel economic networks. The stakes were high, so punishment had to send a message. In the Code of Hammurabi, we see amputations, death sentences, and public penalties. A builder whose poorly constructed house collapsed and killed the owner could be executed. If the owner's son died, the builder's son might be put to death in return. The principle was not just retribution, it was demonstration. The community needed to see consequences. Mosaic law also contains capital punishments for certain offenses, especially those tied to covenant violation or social breakdown. Idolatry, murder, and severe moral transgressions were treated as existential threats to the community's survival. These punishments were not random acts of cruelty. They were framed as necessary to remove corruption from the group. The language often emphasizes purging evil from among you. Justice was not only corrective, it was protective. Yet alongside harsh penalties, there were limits. The famous principle, eye for eye, is often misunderstood as brutal escalation. In reality, it functioned as restraint. It limited retaliation. If someone injured you, you could not take more than equivalent compensation. It prevented blood feuds from spiraling endlessly. In this sense, retribution served stability. Ancient law codes walked a narrow line between fear and fairness. They relied on visible consequence to discourage wrongdoing. But they also attempted to standardize punishment so it would not depend solely on rage or personal revenge. The fear underlying all of this was disorder. Cities were fragile. Agriculture depended on cooperation. Trade required trust. If crime went unchecked, the entire system could fracture. So law became a shield against collapse. It reminded citizens that actions had predictable consequences. It reduced uncertainty. It imposed structure where chaos threatened. Ancient punishment may appear harsh to modern eyes, but in its original context, it was a calculated response to vulnerability. Without enforcement, law is suggestion. With enforcement, it becomes power. As we move deeper into the ancient world, one theme becomes impossible to ignore. Law was rarely presented as human invention. It was framed as divine command. Kings did not simply say, "I decided this." They said the gods commanded this. Urnamur claimed that the moon god had chosen him to establish justice. Hammurabi carved himself, receiving authority directly from Shamash, the god of the sun and righteousness. Mosaic law is introduced not as political reform, but as revelation delivered by God at Sinai. This framing was strategic. In societies where religion and governance were inseparable, divine endorsement made law unquestionable. To disobey the code was not merely to defy the ruler, it was to defy cosmic order. This is where ancient law becomes more than regulation. It becomes theology. In Mesopotamia, justice was tied to maintaining balance under the watch of the gods. Chaos, crime, and disorder were seen as disruptions to divine harmony. The king's role was not just administrator, but mediator between heaven and earth. In Israelite tradition, obedience to the law was directly linked to blessing or curse. Drought, invasion, and famine were interpreted as consequences of covenant failure. Law shaped history itself. Even in Egypt, where formal law codes were less preserved in monumental form, the concept of mayot, truth, balance, cosmic order underpinned governance. Pharaoh ruled as the guarantor of divine equilibrium. The message across civilizations is consistent. Law was sacred. This sacralization served two purposes. First, it strengthened compliance. If a rule is believed to originate from divine will, resistance becomes morally dangerous. Second, it unified communities under shared belief. Law was not only something you followed, it was something you believed in. But there is tension here as well. If law is divine, can it change? Empires rise, circumstances shift, economic systems evolve. Yet divine law implies permanence. This tension forced societies to reinterpret rather than replace. Amendments were framed as restorations of original justice rather than innovations. In this way, ancient law codes reveal something profound about human psychology. We seek stability. We crave authority that feels larger than ourselves. By anchoring justice in the divine, early societies created a foundation that felt immovable. Law was not just policy, it was cosmic structure. And when justice is carved into the universe itself, obedience becomes more than civic duty. It becomes sacred responsibility. As ancient societies expanded from city-states into regional powers, law took on another critical function: unification. When a ruler governed only a single city, customs could remain local. But when territories stretched across rivers, deserts, and diverse populations, shared rules became essential. Conquered peoples spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and followed different traditions. Without a common legal framework, empire fractured. This is where law shifted from local justice to political glue. Hammurabi's Babylon was not just one city. It ruled over many. By inscribing a comprehensive code, Hammurabi signaled that justice would operate under a centralized authority. Disputes would not be settled solely by tribal loyalty or local custom. They would be judged under Babylonian law. The same principle appears in later empires. Law standardized contracts, trade regulations, marriage rules, and inheritance patterns. Merchants traveling across regions could rely on predictable systems. Taxation became organized. Labor obligations were defined. Predictability strengthened control. But unification did not mean equality. Often imperial law coexisted with local traditions. Rulers allowed subject peoples to maintain certain customs as long as loyalty and tribute were secured. Law became layered. Central authority on top, local practice beneath. This layering reveals something important. Ancient law codes were not only about punishing wrongdoing, they were about integrating difference. They reduced friction between groups. They made large political entities manageable. Yet control was never far away. Written law allowed rulers to monitor economic life. Debt, property, ownership, labor contracts, all became legible. And once something is legible, it can be taxed, regulated, and enforced. Law created order, but it also created visibility. Subjects could not easily claim ignorance. When rules were public, carved or proclaimed, accountability tightened. Authority became less negotiable. At the same time, common law codes fostered shared identity. People living under the same legal structure began to see themselves as part of a broader system. Justice, even when imperfect, created cohesion. In this sense, ancient law was infrastructure. It built roads of expectation across territories. It connected strangers under a single authority. It transformed scattered communities into governed populations. Law was not just about right and wrong. It was about unity and the subtle art of maintaining power over complexity. By the time we reach the end of the ancient world, something remarkable has taken place. What began as spoken custom in small communities has become written authority carved into stone, clay, and memory. The earliest law codes were not perfect. They were unequal, hierarchical, and often harsh. They protected power as much as they restrained it, and yet they introduced something revolutionary. The idea that justice could be instead of relying entirely on personal revenge, family retaliation, or the unpredictable mood of a ruler. Early societies attempted to define standards. A theft had a known consequence. An injury had a prescribed response. A contract had enforceable terms. This predictability changed civilization. Trade expanded because agreements could be trusted. Property could be transferred with clarity. Disputes could be judged against shared expectations rather than personal emotion. Law created a framework within which complexity could grow. Even when later cultures revised, replaced, or reinterpreted ancient codes, the foundation remained. The concept of written law endured. The idea that authority should articulate rules publicly endured. The principle that punishment should be proportional endured from Mesopotamia to Israel. From early city-states to expanding empires, law evolved. But it never returned to being purely oral tradition. The deeper legacy lies in a simple but powerful shift. Before written law, justice was local and fluid. After written law, justice became institutional. This institutionalization carried both promise and danger. It could limit tyranny by binding rulers to declared standards, but it could also entrench inequality by freezing social hierarchy into text. Ancient lawmakers likely did not imagine modern courts or constitutional systems. They were responding to immediate needs, conflict, property disputes, political consolidation, social survival. Yet their solution, writing justice down, shaped the trajectory of human governance. Every modern legal system, in some distant way, echoes those early tablets and stelae. The impulse to define rights, specify penalties, and regulate society through codified rules traces back to Babylon and Sinai. The origins of ancient law codes reveal something enduring about humanity. We fear chaos. We seek order. We crave fairness, even if we rarely achieve it perfectly. And so we write our rules in stone, hoping that permanence will bring stability. The first lawmakers carved more than punishment into clay. They carved the blueprint of civilization itself. The traces of our ancestors from thousands of years ago continue to whisper who we are today. Completing this fascinating panorama, we saw once again that human intelligence and spirit transcend time. Take care of yourselves until we meet again on the next journey of discovery.